Before the next episode of X Job Downloaded starts, I have a big favour to ask. If you've enjoyed any of our episodes so far, please can you click on the follow button on your platform. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon and YouTube. It costs nothing to follow, but makes a real difference to me as a podcast producer. Thank you. This interview is being tape recorded. My name is Paul Maleary and this is X Job Downloaded. And today I've got the absolute pleasure of interviewing Adrian Tudway. Now, Adrian was a former Royal Marine, a member of the Metropolitan Police, and is now running SB Worldwide Innovations, which is absolutely fantastic. And we'll come on to that at the end of the interview. But Adrian, thank you so much for seeing me today from your lovely garden.
Not so lovely today, Paul. There's a lot of rain and a little bit of snow as well out there.
I know, it's a bit grim. So where did it all begin? Where were you born and, what's your background?
I was born in 1962. So for the mathematicians listening, I'm 60 years old, just heading up to 61. I was born in Leicester in the Midlands and moved with my family up to live with my grandparents up in Manchester, in Chatterton. And then at the age of about 7 or 8, I moved to Richmond with my mum and dad, where my dad got a job working for the local authority here. And we moved down to a lovely little place called Ham.
Very nice.
Sitting between Richmond upon Thames and Kingston upon Thames. Lovely place.
And how old were you then?
I think I was about 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old.
So you've lost that accent over these years, haven't you?
I've picked up so many accents over the years and discarded so many. There's a little bit of everything in there, I think.
Fantastic. So you go to a normal secondary school, or were you a grammar boy?
No. I went to a Church of England primary school, and then I went to the local comprehensive, a school called Greycourt, which is in Ham, which is now one of the most sought-after schools in the area. I have to say, sadly, when I was there, it perhaps didn't have quite the same reputation.
So you've gone through your primary school, your secondary schooling, and at 16, you've got I'm envious because, you've got a hatful of O-levels, but
it's a very small hat.
Yeah, well, listen, it's bigger than the one I've got, let me tell you. But yeah, so you've done your O-levels. What happened at the age of 16?
Well, I'd already decided several years before that I had my sights set on being a Royal Marine, and I'd been working towards that since I was about 13 and a half, 14. So I finished my O-levels at the first week of July in 1979. And on the 23rd of July, just 3 weeks later, I packed my bags, left home and took the train down to Lympstone in Devon to the Commando training centre where I did my basic training.
And they've got their own train station there, if I remember rightly. Is it called Lympstone Commando?
It is, yes. When I arrived there, it was just a length of concrete platform, and you were unceremoniously booted off the train that ran between Exeter St David's and Exmouth into the arms of the instructors who were waiting to meet you. It was all very friendly.
What was that like? Yeah, all very friendly, I'm sure. But what was that like? It was a very, very interesting now looking back on all of that experience, bearing in mind that actually getting into the Royal Marines is very difficult. The process for selection is extremely arduous, nothing like as arduous as the training itself. But so there's a great deal of build up, but there's nothing that can prepare you, I don't think, as a 16-year-old to the shock of capture when you step out onto the platform at Lympstone Commando and there's a couple of smiling sergeants there waiting to welcome you to your new accommodation. And as I recall, I think there were 66 of us, I think, on the train to start our course that day. 65 of us got off the train. one hesitated at the door and pulled it shut again and stayed on. And we spent the next few minutes running up and down the railway embankment with our suitcases on our head.
Incredible.
But just, it's all part of it. But I have to say, it's in terms of organisations, I think without question, of all of the organisations, all of the different organisations I've come across throughout the remainder of my life, there isn't anyone anywhere in the world as forward-leaning and proactive as the Royal Marines about the way they take people in, the sort of almost surgical precision with which they look at an individual and help shape and mould you. It's very tough. It's mentally as arduous as it is physically arduous, but the whole of the training is designed to mould and shape the young lad who steps off onto that piece of concrete into the finished article 30 weeks later when you hopefully when you pass out.
So what time of year was this? This is 1979, but what time of year?
It was 23rd of July 1979. So again, nice and sunny. Thinking, oh, this is lovely. We're by the sea in South Devon. Wonder if there'll be ice cream.
Yeah. No, you're going to be running across the Brecons and places like that.
And you have, of course, the railway station and the camp is right on the estuary of the River Exe, which has enormous long mud flats at low tide. So you spend plenty of time out in the mud, thigh deep, trying to run and keep in step, although that's impossible. And that's all part of the character building stuff. But interesting anecdote. One of the things that stuck with me all my life and allowed me to remain cheerful through adversity was when I was out in the mud on the River Exe, and an instructor sort of saw me lift my head up as we were lying in the mud. And he said, "Son, get your face back in that mud." He said, "Whilst you're down there, open your eyes." He said, "Because in life, if you have a look, there's always something amusing, an amusing worm or something to laugh at." And you know what? That has stuck with me all of my life.
Incredible. And so what was the attrition rate like? Because I would imagine not everybody made it through the basic training there.
No, I think of the lads that I joined with, there were 11 who passed out.
Wow.
I didn't pass out with the lads that I joined up with. I ended up fracturing a shin about a third of the way into training. So I had 6 weeks out whilst that repaired, and then joined another troop. And I passed out about 6 or 8 weeks after the guys that I joined up with.
So you passed out early 1980 then, I would.
Yeah, about April time 1980.
Wow. It's incredible, isn't it? We're talking 42 years ago. 43 years ago.
I'm only 23. Yeah. What do you mean?
43 years ago. And if you take yourself back 43 years from then, it's 1937. We hadn't even started the Second World War at that point. It's incredible, isn't it?
Do you know, that is the politest way I've been called an old codger today.
Well, I'm not insinuating that at all, but can you imagine our grandfathers using a telephone, let alone talking to each other over a VoIP, over the internet? The fact that they didn't have telephones in their homes in those days, and they didn't even know, albeit Adolf Hitler was on the ascendancy, they didn't even know there was a war on the horizon.
It's amazing, isn't it? I was very, very fortunate as a child that I knew my great grandfather, and he had been in one of the Lancashire regiments during the First World War.
Brilliant. And
he never talked about it, but I never ever saw him frown. I never knew him to be cross about anything. And even in his, he must have been in his late 80s. He used to take me and my little brother out on the bus on his own. And I can remember him saying to me, "Don't worry, there's nothing in life really worth worrying about." And I suppose after you've seen the horrors that he must have seen, you can understand why, can't you?
Yeah, it puts it all into perspective. So you're a young Marine now. You've done your basic training. Where do you go to? What unit do you get
posted to?
I was posted straight up to 4-5 Commando Group up in Arbroath in Scotland, on the east side of Scotland. And I went up there. That unit then and now specialised in mountain and Arctic warfare. So I went up there and started about 18 months worth of continuation and specialist training that you then go on to do. Because although, of course, you come out of the training school, out of Commando Training Centre, and you feel that you're invincible and you truly believe that you can fly, actually you really can't. And there's a lot more work to be done by the other people either side of you to turn you into the finished article. So I went up to Arbroath, and I then did mountain Arctic warfare training. I went out to North Norway and did a winter out there. We did a lot of work in the Highlands, up on the Isle of Skye and places like that. Some of the most beautiful places on earth to visit. And it was really interesting. It was very hard. And of course, for people who are a lot younger than you and I, the idea of being away and not being able to telephone, it must be quite fascinating to them. You know, there was no internet. So if we'd been out up on the mountain tops for 7 or 10 days and we came back down to a base in Norway, you might hope that on the Saturday night in the NAFI they might show a film, you know, and that had been one of those old spool to spool projectors, and everybody'd sit round. You know, you wouldn't sit on your phone and decide which film you might want to watch. You know, everybody watched the same thing.
It's
very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I interviewed a guy called Andy Merry, who's now beefeater at Tower London, and he went through. He was a Royal Marine, finished as a warrant officer, and we had a similar conversation because the phones, as much as they're a godsend, they get people in an awful lot of trouble. You know, you only have to look at what some young soldiers and Marines have been involved in, where they've inappropriately used their phone, and police officers. I mean, if there was an extra charge of gross stupidity, that's the one they should be charged with, not anything else, because it's just they're just, you know, they read all about it and they're so stupid. But yeah, it is fascinating, and you think reel to reel or spool to spool films, and we were just getting into videos, and CDs were just about to come into fruition at that point, and now they've gone. So it's funny how things have changed so quickly.
Yes, I think I saw my first video player a couple of years after I left or as I was leaving the Marines. It was about that sort of time. They were just coming out, but only very rich people had them. And, you know, there was something else.
Yeah, there was something else. And now we've got it all on demand. So did you serve overseas in the Marines?
I did. In 1981, I was part of, and I did some additional training in intelligence and intelligence gathering, and I went to Northern Ireland, to West Belfast in 1981 for a 6-month tour, which covered the IRA hunger strike.
Yeah.
That was a very, very busy, very, very busy and lively tour of West Belfast. And lots and lots and lots of things happened. It was probably the most lively time for a considerable period then. And it was one of those things, again, that sort of sticks with you. The resilience of the Irish people, and this strange idea that you were going there to protect the population, but actually the population hated the sight of us.
Yeah, they didn't want protecting, did they?
Well, I think they did. Part of them did, but then when they got it, they didn't, if you know what I mean. And it was a very sobering experience, sort of walking the streets. And I have a very vivid recollection of being on a search one morning. I think it was a Saturday morning, of a building that was used as like a youth club in Ballymurphy in West Belfast, just off the White Rock Road.
Yeah.
And the song of the day on Top of the Pops was Kim Wilde, Kids in America. And of course, we all knew this because, I was just 18. And I vividly remember standing in this room, a large sort of hall, a bit like a scout hut or something like that. And there were 3 girls standing in there, and they must have been about 16. I was about 18, and they were lovely looking girls, like the Irish girls are, with dark hair and dark eyes. And nobody turned the radio off at that point, or the speakers off. And so Kim Wilde came on singing Kids in America, and I could feel my foot tapping. And I'm standing there in my uniform with a rifle in my arms, looking at these 3 girls, thinking, my goodness, if circumstances were different, I'd probably be shimmying up to one of you, trying to see if I could get you to have a dance. And these poor girls were all looking as anywhere but at me, because, of course, to have looked at a soldier would have brought dreadful retribution down on their heads. We came across girls who'd had their heads shaved and been tarred and feathered because they'd been accused of looking at a soldier. And that struck me as being the most ridiculous situation to find yourself in, because we're all normal people. We're all human beings at the end of the day, and nothing could have been more natural than having a bit of a jig to your favorite record, but across the divide.
And there's still a divide, and it's still, I've said this previously, this isn't about religion now, it's about organised crime groups. That's what it boils down to now, with the backdrop of religion. But it's
about cash and dirty money.
Black cabs and gaming machines. And it's such a beautiful place as well. You just, when you get out into the sticks, it's lovely. You were out there for 6 months. So we're now getting up to the time of the Falklands. Did you get deployed with 4-5 to the Falklands?
I did, yes. We came back from Northern Ireland. We had some Christmas leave, and we did some training up in Otterburn, up in Northumbria, and then I went. We had an unfortunate accident on the ranges with some mortar ammunition, and a mortar bomb cooked off inside a barrel and killed the 3 lads on the crew, and severely injured another couple of lads on the nearby base plates while they were doing some live firing. And so myself and a couple of others had stepped in to do some extra duties once we came back to the base, in order to allow, to fill in gaps, if you like. So we were allowed to go away on leave and early. We got the overnight sleeper down instead of getting the train on a Friday to go on our Easter leave. And before we went on Easter leave, we had a sort of a very hasty briefing that said, there's some potential for some trouble brewing down in the South Atlantic. And of course, the Falkland Islands, if you were a Royal Marine, you knew exactly where the Falkland Islands were, because it was a base for Naval Party 8901, which was made up of Royal Marines who'd been protecting the islands for years. And so I hopped off on my Easter leave with my oppos, and we got the night train down to London, and we were out and through King's Cross and down into the underground system before the military police had got there with their great big boards to say, if you're from 4-5, you need to turn around and get straight back on the train back north.
Way.
I travelled across town and got a train down to Kent, where my first wife was living with her parents, and got there to find a smirking PC with his car on the driveway saying, "Mate, you've been recalled."
Back you go.
Turn around and go back. Yes, and I went back up to Arbroath. And we were there for a couple of days. Every morning we thought we'd be on the move. So I didn't get back there until the Saturday evening, I think it was. We worked all day Sunday loading our war stores out of the silos on our airfield at our base was called Condor. still is rather, called Condor, loading them onto wagons, and they let us out again on the Sunday night as well, and said we're going to move the following morning, and then we travelled by coaches by a sort of fairly circular route down to Portsmouth, where we were housed at HMS Nelson, and we weren't allowed out then. You weren't able to make phone calls, that sort of thing. Whilst the government of the day sort of decided what they were going to do in response to the invasion, and how they were going to approach the crisis that was sort of unfolding right before their eyes. And then after, I think, one night there, we then moved down and got onto a ship called the RFA Stromness, a Royal Fleet Auxiliary ship, which was a cargo ship originally, and it was just in the process of being sold to the New Zealand Navy. But I think the British government pinched the ignition keys back at the last minute, sent a load of dockies on board, and these guys worked round the clock, cut all of the hold out, and installed tiers and tiers and tiers of bunks, 3 and 4 where there was sufficient headroom high, so that it could accommodate troops. And we all loaded up onto the Stromness and went down below and sailed out on the early tide. I think it was the early tide. Or was it the evening tide? With the passenger time, I can't remember, other than it was dark. And we steamed off out into the channel and headed down into the Bay of Biscay, where we then waited whilst the rest of the task force sort of caught us up, because obviously the situation was unfolding minute by minute at that stage, while decisions were being made. And another of our companies from 4-5 had been out in Brunei doing some jungle training, so they were flown back very quickly and blown out to meet the ships, and then we assembled up as part of the task force. We all raced off down to Ascension Island, just over the equator. We had a sort of an afternoon off at Ascension Island, which was hilarious. I don't know what the female staff at the American naval base, or the American Air Force base rather, on the island thought when about 300 or 400 of us came ashore in landing craft, ostensibly to go and fill sandbags, but in effect to strip off starkers and splash about in the sea and go skinny dipping.
Hilarious.
It was very, very funny. And at that point, or up to that point, in my mind, it was all a bit of an adventure, and we'll see what will happen. And of course, we were, because of technology and its state of development at that stage, we didn't have any television.
No.
We didn't see any newspapers. We only got told what we were told in briefings. But then after a couple of days in and around Ascension Island, we were all cross-decked to ships and configured for an assault landing. And it was then that it started to get a little bit more real and a bit more serious.
I was going to ask you, I mean, I think, and I've never been in that situation other than when I've been deployed on different things, but the smells and the sounds and, being below decks with X amount of people must have been a completely different experience.
Well, I have very little sense of smell these days, and I think I attribute that survival instinct to the time on the Stromness, because there were about 350 of us, I think, in that main hold. There was one entranceway in and out, no air conditioning, and you can imagine, if.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Yeah, if somebody in one corner is slightly indiscreet, everybody gets a bit of it shortly.
What was the atmosphere actually like as you got closer to? Because I can only assume that the weather was changing as well as you move further down. Yes. But what was the atmosphere like on board?
Well, it was very businesslike. I mean, we all knew each other extremely well. We lived cheek by jowl because we didn't have the distractions of phones and the internet everything was, all of our time was spent together. So, your buddy, your oppo, is your eyes and ears behind you. And your job as a young Marine, your job is to watch your oppo's back. And you do that ruthlessly because without even having to think about it, that he's watching your back.
Yeah.
So you don't need to watch your own because your mate's there. And so we did a lot of running up and down the tank decks on the landing ships. I went to Sir Tristram, which was a flat bottom designed as a river vessel. So you can imagine what that's like going through the South Atlantic in April. It was
horrendous,
certainly quite lumpy. They strapped these Mexafloats, as they are called. They're like a floating dock. They strapped those either side of the ship, ostensibly to transport them south, but actually we thought they'd put them either side just to stop us from capsizing. Because the weather was horrific. But by that stage, we'd all found our sea legs, even me, a notoriously bad sailor. And we continued to steam south. And it was only as we got close to the exclusion zone, and then we started to the ship's company were practicing their guns and all that sort of business. The big cannons on the front, the Bofors cannons. Then we really thought, okay, so this is now for real. And I can vividly remember for years afterwards, I didn't really enjoy getting in lifts. I never really knew why, but actually I think it's because our accommodation was down 2 companionways and at about the waterline. The actual accommodation where we slept was down vertical ladders from those companionways, so you're below the waterline. And whenever we went to action stations, the duty sailors had run along and dropped the hatches so that we were stuck inside our mess decks so that we couldn't get in the way of them as they're trying to fight the ship.
I've just gone cold there, to be honest with you, because I can only imagine what that must have been like, knowing
well,
that,
it's sitting there in the dark with just red light on, so that your night vision isn't damaged. Listening to the screaming over the tannoy for more ammunition for the Bofors guns, and different the rangefinders shouting out different quadrants that various waves of aircraft are coming in at. And we obviously the Sheffield, HMS Sheffield was sunk, and other ships as well. I mean, at that early stage, the HMS Sheffield, I think, was the biggest single event. And once that had happened, then everything hardened up, because right, this is it. Nobody's going to put up with that now. We're definitely going to be going ashore and definitely getting on with our job. And for us, I feel very fortunate that as a 19-year-old, I had the benefit of all of that expertise that the Royal Marines throw at you during your commando training. So I knew what I was doing. Physically, I was well prepared. Mentally, as a 19-year-old, I was really well prepared. And we also had the added bonus that because we were a specialist mountain Arctic warfare unit, we also had some decent kit. Our boots were good. We had issued rucksacks, the best that the MOD apparently could provide for us at the time, but we dumped all of those and bought our own. We were allowed to use those. They authorised us to use a Berghaus product. So when we had our final briefings and then got ready to actually go over the scramble nets and into the landing craft themselves, we were ready to go.
And by the time you land on the Falklands, had the Sir Galahad been struck?
No, that was afterwards. Galahad was our one of our sister ships.
Right.
So there was the Lancelot, the Percival, the Tristram, and the Galahad. I was on the Tristram. So when we came into We came up and into Falkland Sound, the passenger water between the two islands, and then bunged a left. That's probably not the most naval term for it, but we went in towards San Carlos Water and Ajax Bay. That was where we then went over the side of the ship in the early hours of the morning, down the scrambling nets and into the landing craft, which were heaving up and down in the sea. So you imagine you're on a bigger ship in the dark with all of your equipment, and you climb over the rail of the ship on a rope net, and the target you're aiming at is coming up and down about 8 feet every few seconds because it's on the surge of the tide and the waves. So you've got to time yourself as you're getting into it, as you're getting into the boat, so you don't fall or you're not crushed between the landing craft and the side of the ship, because that wouldn't end well either.
No.
But of course, again, I'm very fortunate because we'd had the benefit of being trained for amphibious operations as part of our commando training,
and
so we were into the landing craft and then away.
And those landing craft, I mean, I don't know how old they were at that time, but they've probably been around for a few years before they'd actually been used.
Yes, mine didn't quite say "Welcome to the Boer War, Tommy" on it, but I think it probably could have done. They were unchanged since the Second World War, effectively. And in fact, I think some of them were of that sort of vintage.
I'm sure you're probably right,
yeah.
It's incredible. And no disrespect, but you were a kid. I mean, at 19 years old, what you're going through, thank God, very few people will ever go through that again. But what you're going through, and like I say, no disrespect, but you're a kid. You've talked about toughen up and just get on with stuff. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So what was it like? You're sailing across from the Sir Tristram, and you're in your landing craft and you're heading towards the shores of the Falklands. Nobody knew what the Argentinians had done, whether they'd laid mines or, there was no sort of idea around that. And of course, we had a detachment of Marines on the island. What was the feeling like? What were the sights and the sounds?
Well, I mean, a lot of what had happened, certainly for the lads on 8901 who resisted the invasion at the very start and put up the most courageous fight before the governor, Rex Hunt, ordered them to put their weapons down and surrender to prevent a bloodbath. I mean, we knew nothing about what had happened to them at that stage because, of course, we've had no newspapers and no news. But all we were aware of was the briefings we'd had. We knew what our target was. I went me and my mates, we went to Red Beach, which was Ajax Bay, and what was a mutton canning factory that had been long abandoned. And that was going to be the central beachhead for all the stores and also the field hospital, the Red and Green Life Machine, as it became known. So we were in the second assault wave onto Red Beach 1 just after dawn that first morning.
Incredible.
And just before the first waves of Argentine aircraft came in to sort of shooters and bombers. So we went ashore. I had my introductory course into penguin husbandry at that point when we ran up the beach and straight through a penguin colony, and they do look, when you look at them on Happy Feet or any of those other cartoons, they look lovely little creatures.
Yeah.
My God, I don't think I've ever met a stinkier animal anywhere on the planet. They whiff. And they've got very sharp beaks as well. And I'm sure they weren't delighted that we went racing through their nesting site.
Honestly, I'm visualising this now as I'm sitting here, and I'm sure that the people listening to this will be the same. There's that classic image of a Royal Marine with the Union flag on their backpack and they're yomping through. What was that like? I mean, I know I'm trying to. I'm like a kid here. This is boys' own stuff that I'm listening to. But what was that like? I mean, you had to walk miles. It was an incredible feat of human endurance.
Well, yes, it was. And I suppose looking back now, yes, you realise the enormity of it. But as I say, I come back to the point that, the Royal Marines haven't been around since 1664 for no good reason.
Indeed.
And the expertise and care with which you are trained and prepared and conditioned for this sort of task is it's beyond compare. So we landed and we were ready, and we did the jobs that we were asked to do. We dug in. We lived in a slit trench just above the beach, just in the gorse line, for about 7 or 8 nights. Me and my 2 mates, one of whom I still see I speak to him at least 2 or 3 times a week, and he's like a brother. My missus cooks a meal for him, and he's
Brilliant.
over here and stays, and we sit and watch some old nonsense on the telly, but all these years on.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
those sort of friendships never go past a sell-by date.
No.
So we did the first really massive incident, I suppose, were, apart from the air attacks, which were relentless in those first few days, the Argentine Air Force were nothing if not brave. They flew several sorties a day into what became called Bomb Alley, into San Carlos Water and into Ajax Bay, trying to hit the ships with their bombs. And once our colleagues from the army had got their Rapier missiles set up, the attrition rate was about 80 or 90%. So these young Argentine pilots were flying their aircraft in, maybe in a wing of 8 aircraft, in the knowledge that if they were lucky, 2 might get out, but more likely 1, if any at all, on some days.
Wow.
And yet they still kept coming. Quite incredible. But we did a resupply patrol to an OP that was looking down towards Goose Green, or the approaches towards a route to Goose Green, on the night that HMS Antelope exploded. And there's a very famous, iconic now, if you like, image of a ship at night silhouetted with this massive blast and this white corona around the ship of the explosion. Well, that was HMS Antelope, which had been hit earlier, and a bomb that they'd been working on to try and defuse went off. And we just got to the point where we would have rolled over the skyline to go down the other side of the mountain and pass on the food and water and any ammunition that was required to the people doing the lads doing the OP on the other side, when that explosion happened. So we had no option but to lie in the gorse just below the ridgeline and watch all this horror unfolding in the night below us, and watch HMS Antelope burning in the night. And by the time when the fires sort of died down insufficiently and we could get on with what we were supposed to do, we were away for a couple of hours. And by the time we got back down to our trench in the morning, as dawn was breaking, all that was left of HMS Antelope was her bows poking up out of the water, and then her stern poking up, where she'd blown up and folded into a V shape and sunk. Quite remarkable. And it was literally just a couple of 100 metres in front of our trench.
Wow. Well, the first interview I did when I first started doing these podcasts was with a guy called Steve Hutley, who was one of the youngest merchant sailors to go down there, and he described it in almost exactly the same way. He said,
quite incredible.
And he said it was incredible, and it was the turning point of things got real. I mean, things were real anyway, but things got really real. And I can't remember what vessel he was on, but it was effectively the munitions dump, if you like. It was a floating bomb, because that's where everyone got their supplies from. And then all of a sudden he realised that they were a sitting duck. They were a target.
It's amazing, and of course, when you see those sort of things for yourself, it's one thing being briefed on a ship that the Sheffield's been lost, and the that feeling, that stiffening of resolve is one thing, but when you are actually watching it happen in front of you, and you're thinking, there's sailors on that ship.
Oh yeah, and of course, you had the Coventry, you had the Sir Galahad. The Coventry, I worked with a guy who was on the Coventry, and Miranda Hart's father was the captain of the Coventry.
He was, yes, yeah. He's written a very good book as well.
Yeah, it's incredible, but this is living history, and I'm really grateful for your candour. When you progress forward from your line, what was that like as you started pressing forward?
Oh, that we got back into landing craft at Red Beach. And we went right across the water and landed on the other side at San Carlos, which I think was either blue or green, and I can't remember now. I think it was blue beach, and that was our forming up point for the what has become known as the Great Yomp. And we headed off and took the northerly route. We knew that we were pushing back small patrols that the Argentines had out at the little settlements, and we were going to clear two particular settlements. We went first to a place called Douglas House, which was a farm outpost with several buildings and a couple of families living there. And that was possibly the foulest night of my life.
Oh, really?
On the way there, where there was sleet and driving rain all night, sub-zero temperatures, and we must have been moving for about 17 hours. We were carrying in excess of 120 pounds on our backs, knowing that at any moment you might have to dump your backpack and get into a firefight. It was pretty cold, wet, and miserable, but we all kept going. And you do these things, people sort of, again, you often find with accounts of wars and conflicts and things like that, people saying, well, this is for Queen and country. It's not. It's for your mate. You do it because your mate is alongside you, and that he is doing it because you're with him. And that's what it's all about. You do it for each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was talking to a guy the other day who's another beef eater who was out there with the 1st Battalion of the Welsh Guards, and he said, "You know what? I'd do it again."
Yes.
And that's quite, I don't know, sobering. I don't know, but yeah, it's funny how people's psyche works. But yeah, he said, "I'd do it again." He said, "Every Christmas Day I'll go out and cry." He said, but. Because they lost a lot of people as well.
They did, yes.
And he said, but I'd do it again.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? And it's funny how attitudes change and how the prevailing sort of thoughts of a nation change. Only a week or so ago, Argentina declared that, they've got some domestic problems at home, haven't they, with their economy and with rampant inflation. So as these sort of cowboy governments tend to, they wave a bit of a flag and try and rally their people by making some huge statement about the Falklands, which is absolutely ingrained in their national psyche. And I was talking to my son about it. I'm not a user of Twitter or anything like that. That's somewhat beyond me, if I'm honest. But he was saying there were lots and lots of comments from people in the UK on Twitter saying, well, why don't we just let them have it? And you think, hang on a minute. Have you people never been educated? There are people who live on those islands, several thousand of them, who are British.
They are British, absolutely.
They're as British as you or I, and they deserve the protection of the state.
Yeah.
And, they had a referendum only a couple of years back, and 98% voted to remain British.
And they're
well, that's pretty clear, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're proudly British. I mean, there is no doubt. When you've made your way across, and that Great Yomp, as I say, it's iconic watching and there's a statue, I understand now, at the museum of the person with the backpack with the, I think it's a radio aerial.
It's a radio aerial, yeah. He was a radio operator with 4-2, yes, I believe.
I mean, as I say, that's iconic. It's bonkers as well. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers to yomp all that way.
Yeah, we went to after we did Douglas House, and then we went to Teal Inlet, and we spent a night there, and then we made on to our final point, which was at a place called Bluff Cove Peak, on the slopes of Mount Kent, which was our harbouring area then, while we prepared for the night attacks on the peaks that surround Port Stanley. And it was there we saw the aircraft that had attacked the Galahad and the Tristram shrieking in and out, and we realised something awful had gone on down on the water. And my heart goes out to those poor lads on those boats, because they were packed with ammunition.
Yeah.
And there's been lots and lots of books written about the rights and wrongs of it. But the fact remains that some of those lads on those boats met an unspeakably awful end.
Yeah.
And some of them survived, but survived with the most incredibly challenging personal circumstances afterwards. And the name Simon Weston obviously is the first one that springs to mind. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, it's just, I don't know. It leaves me cold. It's made me quite emotional, actually, but God knows how you feel at every anniversary, and it's just I don't know.
Well, we tend to get together and have a good drink. We have regular reunions. We had our 40th reunion up at Condor, up at the base last June, which was incredible. And my missus came with us, and she said it was like watching one of these apocalypse sort of movies. Yeah. She said, you've got 350 blokes. And bearing in mind that I was amongst the youngest, I certainly wasn't the youngest, and I was just coming up to 60 at that point.
Yeah.
She said, you've got about 300 odd of these blokes who all think they're 19 and a cross between Bear Grylls and Spider-Man, all with 99 pints of lager and just one packet of crisps on board. All wobbling around the base,
How lovely.
She said it was quite hilarious, but it is a family. The Royal Marines is a family, and we look after our own. We look after each other. We'll always help somebody else, but we always look after each other. And so the way we tend to mark these events is we all get together. I don't see any, I don't see any crying or sadness. We have a tremendous respect for those of our comrades who we didn't bring back with us. One of the lads who didn't come back actually shared my room when I was at Lympston in my training. A young man called Keith Phillips, who I will never forget. And he's buried on the islands.
Wow. Have you been back?
I have. I've been very, very fortunate. I've been back. I've been back a couple of times. I managed to win a lottery for a seat on a pilgrimage for 20 years, which is a funny story in itself, because like the silly old bugger that I am, I misread an email. I got the first email, which gave me the date of the flight. And then this was about 18 months out. And then later on, another email came, which I completely ignored, which said, due to various reasons, the flight's come forward by 24 hours.
Oh, crikey.
So I turned up at Gatwick at their special events terminal. And I thought, hang on, it's a bit quiet around here. And I thought,
no.
all those buggers are hiding somewhere. As soon as I walk around the corner, they're all going to jump out and go, yeah. I walked round to the desk, and there was just one young lady sitting there shuffling some papers, and I said, I've come for the flight to the Falklands. And the poor girl was close to tears. She said, that flight went 24 hours ago. You're late.
Crikey.
And I thought, oh, right, okay, well, that's that then. I better go back to work. But a friend had driven me down there, and she said, No, we're not having this. Hang on a minute. And she made a few phone calls and managed to get through to somebody at Brize Norton, who said, yeah, we've got a military flight leaving tonight. If you can get him over here, we'll squeeze him onto the military flight tonight, and he'll be about 6 or 8 hours behind the group that have already left. So we raced from Gatwick right across to Brize Norton, and the rest is history.
Fantastic.
I arrived there. The whole thing had been organised by Commander Rick Jolly, who was the surgeon, incredible surgeon, who ran the field hospital at Ajax Bay. And he wrote a book called The Red and Green Life Machine, which is testament to the Green Berets and the Red Berets of the Parachute Regiment. And he organised this. So as soon as I arrived at Stanley Airfield, he was there. And he said, I thought I'd better come across and see you, because forever now you are going to be known as One-Way Tudway, because you're only travelling with us on the way back. What a wonderful man.
Oh,
and the only person that I'm aware of who has ever been decorated for gallantry by both sides in a conflict, because he was decorated by the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen, for his bravery and his skill in saving all of those lives. And then he went to Argentina at their invitation, and the Argentine government decorated him as well, because he said, it doesn't matter who you are, you know, when you come through the door, we'll put you right.
Amazing.
And he did. They didn't lose a single person
Absolutely
at the field hospital, I don't think.
So You've seen the screaming aircraft, and you know that something bad's gone on the water, and is that before you've yomped?
No. We were in our harbouring area up on the slopes of Mount Kent, just on the reverse side of Mount Kent. And what the idea was that we were there in order to prepare ourselves, shake down into our small teams then to go and attack the ring of mountains that surrounds Port Stanley itself. But for a variety of reasons, including the loss of the Atlantic conveyor, on which all our medium lift, or most of our medium lift helicopters had gone, and the heavy lift, the Chinook helicopters had been sunk. And also because of what happened at Bluff Cove with the Galahad and the Tristram, and the strain that put on the resources available, we actually stayed at Bluff Cove Peak for several days and mounted patrols at night just to harass the enemy positions. But it was time very, very well spent, and there was a really good reconnaissance done of the three peaks: Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, which was the night battle I was involved in, and Mount Harriet to the south. And then on the night of the 11th and 12th of June, 1982, we assaulted that ring of mountains, and that in itself was interesting now to sort of reflect back on. Because in order to get from where we were in our harbour area and to be in proper striking distance, realistic striking distance to get up the mountains, we had to move into the no man's land. So we moved overnight the night before and got to our laying up area, and we lay in the gorse so that we were minimising our movement. Because, of course, the enemy up on the mountains were looking for us. They knew we were out there somewhere, but they didn't know where, and expecting us. So we sort of lay there for an entire day, really, just cracking jokes with one another, you know, check your kit again, make sure your ammunition's right. And, you know, everybody wants to be near a Scouser. For any Americans listening, a Scouser is somebody who comes from Liverpool, and they are the funniest people on the planet. If you speak to a Scouser, they've always got a joke. So, we spent the entire day there lying up, waiting. And then as darkness fell, we then sort of moved forward and crossed our start line to do the assault up the mountains.
And I suppose that, you know, you are an elite fighting force. Were the Argentinians to that level? I mean, have they got an equivalent of the Royal Marines?
They said they had their own special forces, yes. 601, I think they were called 601, 602 and 603 were their unit designations. And they were interspersed all around the place. But by and large, the vast majority of the Argentines were your conscripts. And some of them were very, very young indeed. I spoke to a landing craft coxswain later on, much later on, who'd taken an entire high school class of boys off a beach when they'd been taken prisoner. These were all 15 or 16-year-old boys, and the teacher had been given stripes and told that he was now a sergeant. Oh. You know, and some of these kids, the environment is incredibly harsh. If you imagine going to the northernmost point in Scotland in the grip of winter and then living out without cover for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, you know, it's a battle to keep yourself healthy. It's a battle to keep your feet healthy, and to avoid frostbite or frostnip or exposure and all of those other ailments, trench foot, all those things that that can befall you. And of course, we were well trained and well motivated, and we were also looking after one another, because you always look after your oppo. So we were doing that and felt good. But for those youngsters who had virtually little or no military training at all, that must have been appalling.
Well, it must be.
It must have been absolutely appalling, you know.
I can't imagine. So at what point how long were you there before the island? You've gone through your battles, and which were probably quite horrendous in themselves. But
they certainly were.
How long before liberation took place? You know, how long before you got to the governor's house?
Well, it all rolled on almost sort of sequentially after that. We started our fight. We were due to cross our start line, I think, an hour or 2 hours after the Paras opened their start line on Mount Longdon. But for a variety of reasons, there were some delays all the way down the line. But we eventually got told we were green to go, and we did what Royal Marines are famous for. We did it as a silent night attack up a mountain, and we got to within about 50 yards of the enemy before they even knew we were there. And then very helpfully, some young Argentinian thought he'd heard something, and came out with a handheld flare and stood next to one of their heavy machine guns and set this flare off. So he illuminated not only himself, but also one of their heavy machine guns. I don't know whether they ever found a scrap of him left, because he must have been taken to pieces from all sides.
Oh, I bet.
But we fought our way up and over that mountain. And once you get in close, it is bitter, dirty gutter fighting.
Yeah.
You don't have time for trying to aim a rifle. It's shovels, grenades, and bayonets. We fixed bayonets to go up. It really is the most brutal thing you can imagine. And it is kill or be killed. And afterwards, you look back and think, wow, was that even real? Did that really happen?
Does that impact on you now? I mean, in later life, has that impacted on you?
Yes, I think it has. Yes, it most certainly did at one point.
Sorry, Adrian.
No, it's no problem at all. And I think you would be less than human if it hadn't.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us imagined that we were, or acknowledged that we had any lingering effect from what we'd done afterwards. But it was a little bit like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest at night in the accommodation on the base, because lots of people started sleepwalking who hadn't sleepwalked before, and all that sort of thing. And people would have coffin dreams where you'd suddenly wake up feeling suffocated and shouting in the middle of the night, and those are the lower end of it, and there are some people who are dreadfully badly affected, and it affects their entire life going forwards. And it's a bit of a lottery, really, as to whether you're one of those people who are affected or one of those people who aren't. But I had my challenge, I suppose, probably a decade later, and I hadn't really acknowledged at all that I carried any baggage, except that I occasionally had some bad dreams at night, and I would very occasionally sleepwalk. And my first wife thought I was bonkers in the middle of the night when she caught me in the back garden sleepwalking and trying to dig myself into a border covered in mud at 3 o'clock in the morning. But I dealt with as the first detective, the only detective actually, at night to a murder-suicide in Battersea. And a young woman had been shot in the face with a sawn-off shotgun. And then the murderer turned the weapon on himself. And it was a domestic situation. Dreadful. But the young lady had the most horrific, catastrophic head injuries. And that triggered something for me, the catastrophic head injury. And after that, I went and had a little bit. The Met were absolutely brilliant. And I went and had a little bit of talking therapy, only I think about 5 or 6 sessions that just help put everything into context. And I've never looked back.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it's, as I say, I think that it's no reflection upon anybody. I think one of the stigmas that comes with any form of psychological impact is that people feel, well, there must be something wrong with me, or I'm a lesser person because I've had this consequence for myself where some of my mates maybe haven't, so I must be weak. Absolutely, that's absolutely not the case. And in fact, it's that sort of internal narrative that does further damage for people. Actually, it is a perfectly natural human response to absolutely unnatural circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And so the only lingering effect that I have now at the grand old age of 60 is my wife bans me from watching any type of war films before bed.
Well, I hope you don't have nightmares tonight, because I don't want to be the cause of any any domestics. Well, so you've gone through this horrendous battle, and do you regroup before you go to the governor's house, or?
Yes, yeah. I mean, we fought through the night, and as first light came, HMS Glamorgan had talk about an act of selfless self-sacrifice. We knew that we had our own artillery behind us who were able to fire on our position, and as it became bogged down, the Argentinians had bigger artillery pieces than we had, and of course they'd had months to dig in and fortify themselves, and they knew exactly where their positions were. So as we were overrunning their positions, they were then able to fire missions actually onto their own trenches.
Right.
So we lay under this barrage from these enormous artillery shells, a couple a minute coming in at one point, pounding the top of the mountain, trying to shake us off. And we're all sort of lying there trying to find whatever cover you can, caught in the open on a saddle between the two peaks. And, it was horrific. But HMS Glamorgan, who'd been providing us with absolutely vital naval gunfire support from just out in the bay, they knew that there was a land-based exocet system that couldn't operate at night. So they were safe to operate whilst there was darkness.
Right.
But they needed to get off that gun line and be out of harm's way before dawn broke. But the the skipper of Glamorgan and the crew stayed longer than they should have to make sure that we were okay and to fire us in so that we could finally get into proper cover and away. And as a result, they took an exocet through the back of the ship, and they lost a number of men dead and seriously injured. And it just, I suppose it shows the selflessness and the sacrifice that professionals will make for another in circumstances like that.
Yeah, it is.
Quite incredible. Quite incredible.
So did you had 2-9 Commando?
We had our own, our own artillery, and they were, we were very fortunate within the structure of the Royal Marines at that time, because we were a commando group as opposed to just a commando unit.
Right.
So being a commando group, we had our own flight of helicopters, little Gazelles. We had our own battery, and we had our own team of commando engineers as well. So we were a sort of full package, if you like.
Self-sufficient.
Yeah. Yes.
I had a guy around here earlier on, actually. He was out there with 2-9. Yeah, he's one of my best mates. And it's interesting.
Well, he is. And if you ever get stuck, and he's 50 yards behind you, get him to throw stones at whatever it is in front of you, because they're really accurate.
If only he could hit a golf ball with such accuracy. Actually, I'm glad that he doesn't, to be fair. So you've moved on. How long were you in battle before liberation actually took place, though?
Well, we spent the rest of that the following day on top of the feature that we were on top of, while units pushed through us and around us, and the Scots Guards went to Wireless Ridge and Tumbledown.
Yep.
Which has all been very well documented, and we were going to push through then and to Sapper Hill, but we were told to hold, which is what we did. And then as we slowly started to advance, the first order came to say, there's white flags flying over Port Stanley, which came up and down the line. And of course, again, because communications were very rudimentary in those days, a lot of it, you relied on passing messages backwards and forwards, you know. So at one particularly hilarious point earlier in the conflict, long before that, but I think it was on one of the stages of that long yomp, a warning from the front of air raid warning red came down. By the time it got to the back, it was Galtieri is dead. So we had the first message come down the line to say that there appears to be white flags flying over Stanley. So we started to punch up and move up and close the ring round into the town itself. And we could see streams of Argentinians running down from the mountains, having discarded their weapons and equipment, and they were just running like streams of ants running towards the town. And Port Stanley, the Falkland Islands as a whole, are the most idyllic place on earth. They really are beautiful. And Port Stanley looked like a little picture on a chocolate box you might get at Christmas, or a tin of biscuits, looked beautiful in the early morning light. And there were all these people streaming down in there. And then another message came down the line to say, make your weapons safe. No, the rules of engagement have changed now. You're not to fire unless you're fired on. And then that really was the mark that it was over. And we were directed. Obviously, there was the desire in everybody to make a great big rush for Port Stanley, because apparently the barmaid in the Globe Tavern was just beautiful. But I'm not sure about that. We were directed up onto Sapper Hill and told to go firm up there and wait, which is, so that's exactly what we did. We made our way up to Sapper Hill, and we set ourselves up little bivvies up on the top there. We were very fortunate as well, having been living on dried Arctic rations for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, and sometimes they didn't come as well. So you'd have days where you were quite hungry. We found some some industrial size tins of corned beef and plum peel tomatoes that were obviously part of the catering supplies for the Argentinians. We found them in this thing called a shake-on, the steel container, sea container that goes on the back of an articulated lorry. So we managed to find our way into this shake-on and nicked as much of this as we could. And we had... It was years afterwards before I could face a meal of corned beef hash again. All we did was eat until we were sick, and then eat some more. And we had this for days on end. And then after a couple of nights up on Sapper Hill, we were given instructions then to move down and into town. And we moved into what was the old town hall on the seafront, just down from the cathedral and the Whalebone Arch. And the whole place was completely devastated. There was weapons and equipment everywhere. The logistics operation to organise that clear up, making safe of all of that ammunition, is nothing short of miraculous.
I think they've
quite incredible.
They've just cleared the last mine. I think in the past month or so. I think I've read somewhere that it just cleared the last mine. Yeah,
I believe so. Out of the beaches, out towards Volunteer Point, I think it is. Yeah. Quite amazing. 40 years to clear up the mess that it takes a couple of days for a dictator to make of somebody else's country.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was that like for you? You know, you've gone through every emotion, losing friends. You've seen warships attacked and they've sunk. What was that like when those white flags went up? As a 19-year-old?
I'm not sure there was any. It was just part of what was happening, really. I mean, it seems strange to say it that way, but it was what I was paid to do. Yeah, it was what I'd been trained to do. It's like being a carpenter and never being shown a piece of wood.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden somebody sticks a bit of wood in front of you and says, "Go on, son, bang a nail into it." And that's what we did. There were some sort of real comedy moments when the actual firefight started on the overnight battle on Two Sisters. I distinctly remember at one point thinking, I'm not religious. Oh my goodness, where is he? Yeah. What are you doing? Beam me up, Scotty. And then another point, I was thinking, look, this is just getting really seriously out of hand here. Someone's going to get very badly hurt in a moment. Isn't it? Where's the sergeant major? Isn't he going to come around and stop all this nonsense?
Who was your sergeant major then?
Sorry.
Do you remember who your sergeant major was?
Yes, yeah, a wonderful man called Pat Chapman, MBE. And Pat is still alive. And if you're listening, Pat, hello, sir. He's always going to be called sir.
What was it? How long were you there before you got repatriated back to the UK?
Only a matter of a couple of days. We were amongst the first to get going. So we were up on Sapper Hill for a couple of nights. We were down in the town for 3 or 4 nights, and then they rigged up these like enormous waist-deep paddling pools inside the tank deck of one of the Fleet Auxiliary landing ships. And we went in one end with all our filthy clothing and all the rest of it. Hadn't changed anything apart from a pair of socks for about 8 weeks. We went in at one end and the water was all this sort of grey colour, and we were all in there messing about because it was nice and warm. They diverted the engine's exhaust pipes through the pools to keep them warm, so we're all sort of ducking each other, and spitting water at each other. I'm wondering, what's that crust floating on the top? And so that was our first sort of bath or wash or shower, above and beyond what you could do under limited circumstances to keep yourself healthy, whilst it was all going on. And I distinctly remember then going up to the ship's rail and giving a ceremonial burial to my pants that I'd been wearing. Because I don't think Mrs. Purcell's best could have done justice to the state they were in, and we then were moved out to the Canberra.
Oh, okay.
And pretty much the whole of the Royal Marines were embarked back to the UK on the Canberra. And I have to say, in terms of, conditions like post-traumatic stress that some people were unfortunate enough to develop, I think for us who came home on the Canberra, we had effectively 3 weeks with our mates to decompress.
Yes.
And decompression, for those who aren't familiar with it, is mainly liquid induced.
Was there alcohol on board?
Yes, there was.
Perfect.
Yeah. And we let our hair down, enjoyed ourselves. I can remember wanting to sleep for days. So you'd sleep, you'd get up in the morning. There'd be a head count, we'd sort of make an excuse about having a little briefing on this or that, lasts about half an hour, and then, okay, lads, you can have the rest of the day now. Go up and lie in the sun as we got towards the equator and the weather got nicer. And if you look back at conflicts like Vietnam, for argument's sake, or Iraq and Afghanistan, some of the lessons that perhaps hadn't been properly learned, or the impacts hadn't been properly understood, of people coming from the battlefield and within 48 hours being back at home and feeling lost and alienated and feeling very anxious because their mate's not with them. We had 3 weeks with our mates. And by the time we got to Southampton, I think an awful lot of that potential psychological stress, that pressure cooker, had been vented.
And what was that like landing at Southampton? I mean, let me go back one. What were your family thinking whilst you're in the South Atlantic? Their son, their brother, I don't know what your family was consisted of, but what was the family like?
Well, it's amazing. I have a big scrapbook of all the newspaper cuttings that my mum kept for me. She bought every newspaper every morning and cut everything out and stuck it in a book.
Incredible.
And she went grey while I was away. She used to have lovely sort of chestnut coloured hair, and it was grey by the time I got home. And of course, I was only a kid, so you don't actually understand the impact of that until later in life. Perhaps when, if you've been fortunate enough to have your own children, you understand the worry that sort of thing must have generated for them. It must have been an extremely tough time for them. And they came down to Southampton to meet me, and I remember my dad running along the coaches, and he climbed up the steps of the coach because we knew we weren't being allowed to get off. We were going straight back up to Arbroath.
Oh, really?
So, we were allowed a message, a telegram from the ship, and I got a telegram from the family to say, we're going to come and meet you at Southampton. And I sent a message back saying, no, don't bother. It's not worth it. And I think it took my dad a while to understand that, and it probably took me a while to understand why he found that difficult.
Yeah.
Because as far as he was concerned, all they wanted to do was get eyes on you, and then they know that it's over, properly over, and you're going to be all right. Whereas for me, we had a job to do, and so we wanted to stay together. I didn't want to leave my mates. So we got off the ship, as you did, and we'll put our heads down and tromped straight past our families, to be perfectly honest, most of us, and got onto these coaches. And my dad came up the steps. Is there someone called Tudway on here? And somebody shouted down there, and I was sitting right down the back, obviously. So I came off, got off, gave everybody a quick hug and a kiss and said hello. And then I got back on the coach. We went to Eastleigh Airport, where there was a line of Hercules waiting, and away we went. And I then actually arrived home probably 2-3 days later, having travel down from Arbroath by train. Yeah,
I've got a friend another beefeater who there's a famous photograph of him. He's had his teeth knocked out. A guy called Steve Froggatt, who he retired. Do you know him?
I've come across Froggatt. Yeah,
he's had his teeth, and there he is giving his. And I'll be honest with you, as a kid, I'm a couple of years younger than you. Watching that on the TV, I can't express how proud we were. As a nation, that was just phenomenal. And watching the Canberra, and my grandparents had been on the Canberra, but to watch that was just absolutely incredible. How long did you serve after the Falklands? I mean, everything else paled into insignificance after that, I would imagine.
Yeah. I stayed up in 4-5. I'd already been drafted before the conflict started, but obviously I wasn't going anywhere. I'd handed in my mounted kit. I went and got it back straight away before we deployed. So all the postings, or we call them drafts in our sort of pseudo Navy parlance, had been put on hold. But when I went back up after a period of summer leave, back up to the unit, everything, the machinery of normality began to churn. And I think it was the September or October then that I waved goodbye to my mates in 4-5 and I was drafted to HMS Warrior.
Oh, okay.
At Northwood on the in Hertfordshire.
Oh, all right.
On the border of Hertfordshire and London. And I stayed there for a couple of years on the security team. And it was there really that I sort of came across police officers, because they used to come in and mump a cup of coffee from us in the guardroom. And I'd got married by that stage, got married when I got back from the Falklands, and like a lot of blokes did, very young. And you realise then, well, I'm starting a family and, they need a bit of security and a bit of certainty. And also, whilst it was for me the best job in the world, it didn't bring home a lot of money.
No.
And it was still at that stage, the military was still almost feudal. So if you had there was very little movement sideways between regiments or units. It is happily quite different now.
Yeah.
And people's skills and abilities are used to the best interest of all, as opposed to just being about cap badge rivalry. And because my education, unfortunately, that we talked at the beginning about me leaving school with my hat full of O-levels. When I say hat, it was a tiny little cap and I couldn't squeeze many in. And so my prospects for promotion within the service were lamentably poor at that stage. I'd done very well when I went through basic training. I was actually a King's Badgeman and had been sort of identified earlier on as having, during the Commando phase, as having sort of leadership potential longer term. And the Corps were true to their word and said, look, you could well be the sort of person that we would want to take on as a commissioned officer. However, when they read to the bit that talked about my education, it all went quiet. And they did their best. They sent me away on an education because I went down to Portsmouth for about 10 or 12 weeks to try and retake some exams. But maths has never been my strong point and never will be. And I simply couldn't pass it, even with sort of hot housing training. And so I decided that staying long term probably wasn't the best for me. So I ended up looking to the police.
And where did you go to when you joined the police? I mean, you going to Hendon must have been an absolute breeze because you knew how to keep your kit clean and and you march differently in the Royal Marines. Dave Wilson was my drill instructor or drill leader at Ashford, and he got told off because he marched in a particular way. So we didn't have to march on board, sir. It was
Well, we really didn't have we had a fairly low threshold, boredom threshold for ceremonial stuff in the Royal Marines. But when I went to Hendon, I mean, it's funny now looking back, but I thought I was being double clever. I thought, nah, you're not going to catch me out. All this business of come to Hendon on a Sunday night, I'll go with an empty suitcase. I'll just take a couple of pairs of pants and a couple of pairs of socks and one more shirt so I can rinse them every night and dry them overnight, because they're going to have me running up and down a railway embankment with my suitcase on my head. So I arrived all smug with all these other recruits, looking at their bulging bags and suitcases, thinking, yeah, you're going to be regretting that in a minute, mate, when it's on your head and you're running up and down. And they were all saying to me, good evening, sir, and can we get you a cup of coffee? And I'm thinking, hang on, in a minute, someone's wearing a balaclava is going to jump out of that cupboard and start bashing at us. And, nobody ever did. So that first week at Hendon was fairly austere for me, because I was hand washing everything at night, putting it on the radiator.
Incredible.
Oh, dear. A completely different setup.
Yeah.
Completely different.
And where did you get posted to after your basic training?
I went to Hammersmith, Hammersmith was conjoined with Shepherd's Bush and Fulham, forming F district of the Met. But I was posted at Hammersmith, and I did my street duties course, which was your sort of post the college, post the learning phase, your actual practical hands-on apprenticeship, if you like, on the street. And then I went on to D-Relief at Hammersmith, where I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I had a great time, but I had a particular leaning, if you like, towards crime. And I only actually wore a uniform for 18 months. I didn't make it to the end of my probation in uniform. And one of the things that I was very satisfied about when I came to the end of my service, although if I'm really honest and look at it in a sort of global perspective, probably wasn't as good, was that I remained a detective then for the whole of my service. I never went back into a uniform after 1987. Not necessarily a strength, but then to do all the things that I was privileged enough, fortunate enough to be able to do while I was in the police service. I couldn't possibly have fitted that in without having another lifetime alongside it if I wanted to do, to work in uniform as well. So
yeah, absolutely. And where did you serve as a detective?
I went on to a crime squad at Hammersmith, and so worked all over West London. And we had a focus on drugs mainly at that time, before all of the sort of politics about numbers started coming into policing, and somebody clever realised that crime statistics matter to politicians, and that if somebody had some drugs in their pockets, it wasn't an offence until you put your hand on their shoulder and arrested them, and then it became a statistic.
Yeah.
So you're not to be bothering yourself with drugs. From there, I went on my DC's course up to Hendon again, and I got posted out to Battersea in South London on W District, a real good hard ground, and I worked in the main office there and then on the robbery squad at Battersea. Fantastic time there, really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Was that all robberies, or was that street robberies, or they've had the gold on this past few weeks? I mean, was it every type of robbery, or just
no? We took anything that the flying squad didn't take.
Right.
So they dealt with cash in transit and banks, and there was plenty of that at that stage.
Yeah.
And we dealt with other types of commercial premises or shops, and down to street robberies and muggings. And we had Clapham Junction, massive rail terminus in South London, and a couple of very, very big, very tough council estates on the ground as well. And so there was no shortage of customer base for us.
No, but it's brilliant, isn't it? People pay money to do the sorts of things that we did. I mean, and that's the truth. You only have to look at popular television and books, and it's really good. When you got promoted, what was the inspiration to get promoted the first time?
Right. Well, that's a really interesting one. I was at Battersea, and I had a particular DI at the time. I'll shave his blushes by not mentioning his name, but he knows who he is. And he said to me, "I've been watching you, son," in his South London accent. I said, "Oh, that's very nice, Governor. Thank you." And he said, "I won't use the language he used because it was South London language.
Agriculture.
But I'll interpret it for you into radio English." He said, "You're no fool, are you?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to think I'm not." And he said, "So you'll have a report on my desk by tomorrow telling me that you want to take the exam." And I said, "Oh, right, will I?" And I had never, honestly, genuinely, never thought about taking the exam until that point. So I went away. He just winked at me and said, "Right, go on, get out of here," in agricultural language. And so I went away and had a little think about it. And I thought, oh, right, okay, he's probably got a point. So next day I went in and said, "I've been thinking about what you said, Governor, and here you go. I'd like to take the sergeant's exam." He said, "Yeah, great. Okay. Well done." I worked hard and was fortunate. I passed it just at the point where there was a moratorium in the Met on promotion while they were trying to decide what they did about all sorts of issues. But eventually I went up to Hendon, did a basic sergeant's course, which involved a couple of detectives being attached to a much bigger group of uniformed officers who are all aspiring sergeants. And that was great fun because that was the first time I'd really sort of worked back alongside people doing other types of work than the work that detectives did, and made some friends there who are still mates today. You know, who'd have thought that, eh? And then I came back, did a detective sergeant's course, the intermediate CID course, and I was posted to Brixton, to the main office there, which was, of all of the postings I did out on, as we used to call it, out on district or division in those days, that was far and away the best. Brixton was fantastic. Yeah, it was a bit like Fort Apache, the Bronx.
Yeah.
You know, everything was going on outside the gates and we all stood shoulder to shoulder alongside one another and we just got on with it. We had some serious public disorder while I was there, and I remember sleeping in the office. You know, we had sleeping bags under our desks because some nights you couldn't get out of the station to go home. It wasn't safe. I used to ride a motorbike. You'd get dragged off your bike. So we kept in the office or across the road in the pub. There was a pub there, and the landlady, Mary, used to keep on the benches in there.
They had a great canteen at Brixton as well, if I remember rightly. It was
the canteen there was wonderful, and you know, much is made of in society of the divisions by class and by race and all those things. And all I'll say on what is an enormous subject that I'm in no way qualified to talk on other than anecdotally is that we loved our canteen staff.
Yeah,
those ladies who worked in there, they were all either Jamaican, Ghanaian. They were all ladies of colour.
Yeah.
They were fantastic.
Yeah.
And each station used to take a pride in how they looked after their canteen staff.
Yeah.
So we'd send a car out in the morning to pick them up. You know, you didn't let your canteen lady have to walk to work, did you? At 5:30 in the morning? No, you went out and picked them up, you know, and somebody'd go out and help them carry if they were getting some, you know, the girls used to go out and get yams and things like that from Brixton Market. And so we'd have food that you would never eat at home.
Oh, no.
You know, so somebody'd go out with them and carry their shopping bags and that sort of thing, you know, not all the time, not every time, but as often as was possible. And those ladies were fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, and
they also wielded a savage ladle as well. You know, if they thought you were taking the mick or nicking chips over the top of the counter, I've got scars on the back of my hands now that are down to the canteen ladies and their eagle-like accuracy with their ladle on the back of your hand when you're trying to nick a chip.
It was. I don't even know if they've got a canteen there now, but it was absolutely superb. The food, goat curry, and there was all sorts. It was absolutely brilliant.
It was, and we loved them, and they loved us.
When you bounce through to the chief superintendent rank, which is, a lot of people don't get anywhere near that. Did young Marine Tudway think that he was ever going to get to that?
Nope. No. And I think the truth is that the issue with police promotion is unlike many other sort of disciplines, I guess, in that once the ball starts rolling or the rock starts rolling down the hill, you may as well just keep going. And I became a sergeant, and I very quickly thought, hang on a minute, I respected everybody I worked with and worked for, but sometimes I saw things and I thought I could do that better than you. Mm. So I thought, right, well, I'll have a go at the next one then, and I'll have a go at the next one, and almost by accident, you end up then where you end up. And for me, I was blessed. I ended up as a detective chief superintendent, but the sort of route that I took to get that and the opportunities that that public service sort of provided for me were second to none. I did 15 years, broadly speaking, 15 years out on a division, and then just the world changed beyond all recognition after 9/11. And I was very fortunate as a newly promoted DI to get called up to the yard, and I went up and worked in a department called SO10, the Covert Operations Group.
Excellent.
And I worked up there for several years, and then got promoted again and ended up working in specialist intelligence, working between the agencies and the police, that very grey area where some of the intelligence gathering that is done by our intelligence and security partners at home and abroad has a massive impact on serious and organised crime.
Yeah.
And, there's that strange dance that takes place where evidence that or information that can never be used as evidence can help lead you to the place where an evidential trail can begin, and it rights some really serious wrongs. And I also was very fortunate as that young DI and DCI to become involved in the covert side of kidnap inquiries. Right. And I worked as a green commander first on the intelligence feeds, and then as a red commander as a kidnap hostage negotiator. And at that time in London, we were running about 3 or 4 live kidnaps a week.
None of which are reported, busy. Are they? They don't, these things don't get reported. They don't happen as far as anyone else is concerned, but they're there and they're going on.
Yeah, I mean, they are the one of the most serious investigations you can ever work on, because a kidnap is always a murder that hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah,
but it's not far off. And some are for money, some are for revenge. Most of them, though, are about hard cash, and certainly were in those days. And some of the operations that we did were really, really cutting edge. And there was some great courage shown by many of my colleagues whilst we were doing all of those jobs and getting people home safely.
Yeah.
Some of them would run for days.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And not all were in the UK, some were abroad. I was very, very fortunate. I had the honour, if you can say that, of being out in Baghdad and bringing Norman Kember home, the first live British kidnap victim from Baghdad.
What was that like?
That was incredible. We got
got bounced out there very quickly because we suspected that there was going to be a bit of a breakthrough. We worked very closely with the special forces who were operating on the ground in Baghdad at that stage. And I'm sure he won't mind me saying so, Billy, who a lot of people watch on the telly these days. I think Billy's last job before he finished at Hereford was that hostage rescue for Norman Kember, because we flew out of the red zone together by helicopter, and then we flew back to the UK together, courtesy of British Airways, a couple of days later. So some of those, the opportunities as a police officer to be involved in some of those operations at that sort of level are incredible. I went out a year earlier than that. I was in Afghanistan for a not so successful operation, which unfortunately ended up in me doing a body recovery from Kabul. And yeah, I literally traveled the world, and most recently, it would have been about 2013, 2013. I was deployed out into the southern end of Turkey, right near the border of Syria, whilst desperate attempts were made to rescue some of the hostages who were murdered by the ISIS jihadis, the Beatles group. And interestingly now, looking after the dreadful earthquake that's hit that area, I look at the street where the hotel was, where I was staying for a couple of weeks, just flat, completely flattened by a natural disaster on that occasion, So being in the Met, being in the police service in general is a huge privilege for anybody who is fortunate enough to be able to carry a warrant card. But in my case, I was extremely fortunate to have so many different opportunities to do different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do. I still love the police. That's why we do what we do with our, recruitment and with this podcast. But you've seen Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey. It's brilliant. But I've got to ask you about your Guinness Book of Records entry.
Yes. Yeah, that was great fun. I've got the little certificate up on the wall there. I have to say, I consider my role in the downfall of that record has been a fairly walk-on bit part. Some colleagues of mine, close friends of mine, while we were at Battersea together on the robbery squad, had come up with an idea of doing a drive and raising money for charity for the Royal Marsden, for the Children's Cancer Unit there, to try and help them fund a new ward. And so they collectively came up with this idea of driving through all 43 counties of the United Kingdom, starting out in the Shetlands, then by ferry to the Orkney, then by ferry to the mainland, and then across to the Isle of Man and to Northern Ireland, which in itself was a bit of a logistical feat in 1993. We, as a team, I used the royal we. I have to say, to my eternal shame, I had no part in the organising. Otherwise, we'd probably got lost within 5 minutes. The team managed to talk Ford into giving us two of their latest models. The new Mondeo was just being released, so we had two brand new Mondeos, and we had data-back cameras fitted on the dashboards of these so we could take time-stamped evidential photographs of every county border we crossed. And we did it non-stop, apart from the opportunity to get a little bit of kip on the back seat when it wasn't your turn to drive or map read, or, a little bit of kip on a ferry as you're going across. But we did it in, 96 hours and 9 minutes
between the 17th and the 21st of September 1993. And the thing that I am proud of was the fact that we raised a significant sum, several £100,000 worth, for the Royal Marsden. I can't remember the exact figure now, I'm afraid, through the mists of time. But that money went to equip a children's cancer ward. And I think it's things like that when you see some of the adverse press coverage that is directed at policing, some of it entirely justified when you think about some of the awful things that have gone on. But this is the soft side. This is the compassionate side of policing. And I don't think that there is anybody who starts out their service in policing, or perhaps with one or two very, very notable exceptions, but they are in a micro minority. There isn't a single person who takes that oath to become a police officer who isn't doing it in order to protect those who can't protect themselves from the people who would do them harm, who would take their stuff. It's
I absolutely agree.
Quite humbling.
I absolutely agree. I get really sad. I know why the press do it. I know why they do it, because, it wasn't that long ago that we, the police service, were trying to lock them up for a number of things that they did or didn't do. And some of this is retribution, I would respectfully suggest. But
I think you're right there. And I suppose that therein, actually, the biggest lesson for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
In every barrel of apples, there's the opportunity for one to go rotten.
Yeah, there is, absolutely.
And it doesn't matter what label it has on the outside of your barrel, whether it's police, journalist, doctor, nurse, politician.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how young men get themselves into trouble with modern technology like WhatsApp. Woohoo!
Yeah,
nothing like what's going on up at the big house at the moment, is it? Eh?
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, they're just, but this will pale into what's happening with those particular politicians. Will pale into insignificant when a police officer, one young police officer, does something stupid. I'm not talking about criminally stupid, as we've seen this week with people being sentenced to more time, but they'll do one thing and there'll be hay made by the media because they want to get their claws into them.
Yeah, and I suppose the sad side of that is that the thing that I always reflect on is you might get that one. Normally, it's a young in-service officer who does something ill-advised or downright stupid.
Yeah.
But for every one who has that experience, there will be 10 or 20 or possibly even more, actually, others who will have had a complaint made against them, which takes years to resolve, which puts their entire life and their careers on hold.
Yeah.
And actually, when the investigation is done, they hadn't been at fault. Nobody ever reports that.
No,
because it's not news, is it? Policeman pats small child on the head and child smiles. That's never going to make the headlines, is it?
No.
And that is life, I guess. That's human nature. But sometimes you do feel that the pendulum is swung far too far in one direction and needs to be recentered.
But do you think? I mean, we're going to go on to what you've done in your later life shortly, but.
In my adult life.
In your grown-up life. but do you not think, I think that sometimes the police are their own worst enemies because they don't put the good news out. They don't work with, you look at what happened in Lancashire, work with the media when you need the media, because actually they're another part of an investigation. They're an investigative arm that have got no rules around RIPA or any other part of it. And I think that sometimes they don't put out the right stories at the right times. I just don't think the police help themselves.
Well, I think, again, you and I both had experience as senior investigators and the pressures that there are on you. And I suppose my reflection on that is that you can ask your press officers to give a good news story out as often as you like until you're blue in the face. But if nobody on the other side says, we'll run with that, police officer pats child on head and child smiles story, it'll never appear anyway. You're just dropping a coin into the ocean. And also, I think that both the police service and the journalistic profession need to collectively draw a breath and go to organisational relate to discuss how this marriage can come back on track again, because journalists need the police and the police need the journalists. And, a tiny, minuscule minority of journalists are bad. In the same way that a tiny, minuscule minority of police officers are bad. And when the good on both sides work together cooperatively, it squeezes out the opportunities for the bad on both sides to operate with impunity. And I think that a climate of fear has grown up around it. And many senior officers nowadays are frightened to talk to the press. Frightened of what other people might think, frightened of what the press might do with it. But actually, the older heads amongst the journalists will probably have a very similar view on it, I think, to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we would use the press in order to get part of our stories into the public domain so that the public would come forward and provide us with the information that we want, that we needed in order to progress an investigation. And that's what's lost. And I don't get it, but we could go on about that for hours. Right, Adrian, the grown-up Adrian, you've retired in 2014.
I did, yes.
So 9 years, mate. I mean,
I know, it's a long time, isn't it?
Goes quickly, doesn't it, as well? It's quite scary once you do retire. You wait 9 years, it's like, it's the only job in the world where someone says to you, how long have you got left? I mean, not to live, but until you retire. And then when you retire, time just runs away with itself. But what does the grown-up Adrian do now?
Again, I've been really, really fortunate. When I left the police, I went straight overnight, because I'm a bit stupid like that. I retired on a Tuesday because that was the day of the month to retire. And on the Wednesday morning, I started with Crime Stoppers, the crime charity.
Did you really?
Working for them. Yeah, I worked for them from 2014 until 2017.
And they're really good.
They are. I mean, they are a fantastic organisation. The work that they seek to do in communities is just brilliant. And for anybody who doesn't understand it, just have a look. Search on your pocket doodah for Crime Stoppers UK, and it's a charity that takes information completely anonymously. And so people who are close to something bad that's happening but couldn't dare go to the police can tell Crime Stoppers about it, and Crime Stoppers passes that information anonymously to the police force that are dealing with it. And there is also then the added bonus that if you want to, you can be considered for a cash reward for providing the information. And some of the things that I saw solved as a consequence of information that came to Crime Stoppers was absolutely incredible during my 3 years that I was privileged to work for them. I can't speak highly enough of them. So, as I say, any of you not familiar with Crime Stoppers, have a search in your pocket thingy bob and for Crime Stoppers and have a look at what they do.
And suffice to say, the police do work on the information that's provided, and they will go through every single piece of information to see whether it's a valid referral, to make sure that there's nothing spurious about it, or it's
not malicious.
Malicious, but the work that as a DCI, I'd get these Crime Stoppers and say, well, why haven't we gone? Because 9 times out of 10, it would tie up with other intelligence that was being provided by someone else. And all of a sudden, you've got a bigger part of the jigsaw and it could be acted upon. That's brilliant. So you finished there. What happens next?
I went from Crime Stoppers, and I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity to work with the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman.
Wow.
And that, again, that's an organisation not many people know about. It's called PHSO. It does truly incredible work. They are an organisation that takes complaints against primarily the health service, but also all sorts of other government departments where people have been wronged. So, like the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency or some of those other sort of organisations that are government organisations. And PHSO's investigators will investigate those complaints. So at the very top end of the scale, if you've had a child who's died in hospital because of medical negligence, then PHSO will investigate that. And Rob Berens, who is the current ombudsman and who I was fortunate enough to work for a short time before I finished there, has just very recently, just this last week, gone out in the press and talked about a hospital trust where he had doctors coming to him saying, please don't give up. Don't allow your people to give up. We can't speak out because the trust are telling us not to, but there are bad things going on here and you need to keep digging. And this is about protecting everybody. It's a little bit like it's a bit like beyond the police, in the police, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's protecting the people in society who are least able to stand up for themselves, and it gives them a voice. It gives them an opportunity for their complaints to be resolved. And again, I can't speak highly enough of it. So anybody who's interested in that, Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. Ombudsmen are incredibly powerful people.
They are indeed. And then...
and since then, I've been working with a colleague on a company whose name was still going, with a device called the Safe Booth, which is really interesting. It's a patented design. But it's a modular holding cell, and it's licensed in the UK to hold a person for up to 6 hours inside a police station or inside a prison, or somewhere else that's suitable. And the idea of it is that it's totally ligature free. So it's built from steel panels. A couple of us build them in about 2.5 hours from scratch. So in some of the older Victorian police stations where there are rooms that you can't put a person in because there are pipe work in the roof or that sort of thing, that it would be far too expensive to move, that they could harm themselves with, you could probably erect one of these safe booths inside that, and that provides a safe space. It's got a complete glass front to it through the door, so you can see the person inside. Most importantly, they can see you. For anybody who's anxious, distressed, claustrophobic, this is a far, far better, more sensible option than a cell. And we are just on the cusp, working with some colleagues in Thames Valley Police, on using these safe booths as smart booths, smart health booths, with a video pack on the outside of the door to enable remote healthcare providers to be able to triage a person who comes into custody. So they can, we are in the early stages of partnering with an IT company who have software that will run over our equipment, that will tell you respiration rate, blood pressure, pulse rate. They will tell, they'll give you an indication on a scale as to how anxious a person is, whether they're particularly distressed, can help you detect all sorts of health problems and psychological problems at that very, very early stage when that person first comes into a police station, as well as a host of other uses after that point. Because if you're a superintendent at headquarters and you have to give an authority for a person to remain in custody at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you've got to tip out of bed and drive all the way there in order to do it, you get the custody staff to put this person in the safe booth, and from your kitchen breakfast bar with a cup of strong coffee, you can have a call like you and I are having, where you can see one another. So and give you authorities.
So they don't have to do it in person now, because it had to be an in-person.
Originally, it had to be in person, but a lot of things changed with the pandemic for worse. One of the good things, I think, was the ability to relax the requirements for some of these procedures to be done virtually. Because, of course, if your solicitor wanted to be involved in that, it's a Teams call.
Yeah.
So you simply split the screen and add a solicitor in. If English isn't your first language, you split the screen again and add an interpreter in. It can be an interpreter from anywhere in the world.
So how did you come up with this idea?
Language, it wasn't my idea. It came up. Somebody travelled to the States some years ago now and saw temporary holding facilities, and came back with that as an idea, and it developed and it developed and it developed, and now we are, as I say, we're a very small company, and we are just on the cusp of this really exciting project with Thames Valley Police to use these to help. It's not just about reducing costs, it's about improving service. So if you are in a police station somewhere, let's say for argument's sake in rural Wales, and you come into custody, but you've got a rare or unusual condition, a nurse or a healthcare practitioner who's actually working at that rural station may never have seen anything like that before. But if you are doing a virtual consultation, then there is the opportunity to then dial in a doctor as well, a specialist. So that nurse or practitioner might say, I recognise something that you as the person sitting on the other side of the camera may not even be aware of yourself. And bring in a specialist practitioner, and it's about saving lives, saving risk, and speeding up processes as well. If you have to wait for somebody to travel 40 miles, when you could have had a call like this face-to-face to do the same business with all of your legal protections in place, you're going to be out of that police station one way or another in significantly less time. Yeah. So it's about improving processes and speeding things up, and also about making the best use of limited resources, because let's face it, an awful lot of the police estate in the UK and abroad is old.
Yeah.
And so those buildings weren't designed with 21st century safety in mind. So they have ligature points and, all that sort of thing. And it's not just the police. You think about prisons.
Yeah.
If you could have a couple of these smart booths on every wing of a prison, and then when prisoner A says to the prison officer, I really don't feel well, I need to go and see a doctor, and they're thinking, how do we risk assess this? Taking this person right the way across the estate, when that prison officer can say, okay, I'll be back to you. You go and have a sit down. I'll come back to you in 20 minutes when the smart booth is free. We'll put you in, and they have a triage call to the nurse on duty in the prison's healthcare unit, who's able to say, actually, there's nothing wrong with this person. Give them a couple of aspirin. They're trying it on. On the other hand, who'll be looking at the biometrics coming up, saying blood pressure is really high,
yep.
Pulse rate is really high, they're clearly very distressed, signs of agitation, they must be in pain. Actually, don't bother bringing them all the way to the healthcare centre. Call an ambulance now. This person needs immediate acute healthcare. So the ability to speed up those processes, save all of the risk to prison officers as they are moving people around an estate, and to the people themselves whose liberty's been deprived. This is a really interesting, I think, development. And then so you extrapolate it one step further. Okay, the boxes that we are producing at the moment in the main only have a door handle on the outside. But we've produced models with a door handle both sides for use for police witnesses, for argument's sake, to give evidence remotely to a magistrate's court. You think nowadays all the people who are disenfranchised from accessing the health service, because when they go to hospital for their follow-ups, they have to go to a general hospital, which might be miles away. And of course, there's only so many hours in the day for people to come into the hospital. If Boots the chemist, for argument's sake, or Sainsbury's said, yeah, we'll have a couple of these health booths in our store in a small area on one side, and you've got a follow-up for your general hospital, but it's 40 miles away, you go to your local Boots we've not spoken to Boots, so I apologise to Boots for the unwanted plug, but you go there or to your local supermarket, you can sit in the booth, and then the hospital, you can speak to your hospital consultant, who, whilst you're sitting there, has got a little chart next to him saying, yeah, blood pressure's good, pulse rate's good, breathing rate's good, they don't look too anxious. Actually, we all know if you have to have a procedure at a hospital, you normally have 2 or 3 assessments
before you have the procedure, and then normally a couple afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, you don't need to go normally to hospital face to face to have all of those appointments. You think how much it could speed things up and how much better it'd be for older people, for argument's sake, who don't have access to the internet. So I am hoping that at some point this will really take off.
But if you had this in the foyer of a doctor's surgery, it could be the precursor to them walking in and actually seeing the quag.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. We also, all of the surfaces of this booth are coated with an antimicrobial paint. It's the same stuff that they use in metal equipment in operating theatres. So It has copper sulfate actually in the mix of the paint. So if you've got COVID or another virus, that virus dies on contact with the painted surfaces.
Wow.
So you don't have to decontaminate them in the way that, when COVID was at its height. One COVID positive prisoner could close a custody suite for 72 hours. This is open the door, give the walls a wipe down with antibac, and it's good to go again. I mean, there are so many positives.
These. Absolutely. I mean, you just, and it could be a focal point for so many, you could have one of these at a Premiership football club. It's just somewhere, if someone can walk in and get a screening check done within this smart booth, then it just makes life a lot easier for so many people. It does. And again, you talk about football, the cost to the police and to football clubs of policing football matches, because officers have to be abstracted and taken away to somewhere else to deal with a prisoner, a person who's been detained during the match. Well, all you do is you take them downstairs, put them into one of these smart booths, read them their rights, serve them a banning order, and then put them on a bus, take them, however far away. If they're not to come within 5 miles of the football ground, you put them on a bus them out 5 miles, and away they go. You've not lost that officer. Yeah, precisely. It's so many of the minor disorder offences that are committed at sporting and music venues. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Festivals. People who are so drunk they can't look after themselves. Well, they're in there. They're on video all the time.
Yeah, because they shouldn't be in the care, custody or control of a St John's ambulance person, because they're busy enough as it is. The police haven't, in real terms, they can't put them in a cell. So to have them in a holding area that can be fully monitored, and if their vitals are, be able to take their vitals, it would just save so much time.
It would. And when you're finished with it, you just drop it and put it back on the wagon. It takes less time to take it apart than it does to build it. And of course, if you put it in room A this week and decide next week you wanted it in room B, we come back, dismantle it, carry it up the corridor and build it in room B.
Wow.
There's no cell or tape recorded interview room or video recorded interview facility anywhere in the world that can say that.
No. I'm going to put all your links in the body of the text connected to this podcast, and we'll share this within our network and the people that we regularly go to and more. But
thank you very much.
No, you're welcome, Adrian. I mean, I've asked this question before, but are your folks still around?
Yeah, I am. Well, the biggest, to my mind, the biggest privilege in life is the position that I'm in at the moment. My wife and I moved 5 years ago to the flat we live now. We downsized savagely from a great big house to a flat because I could be on the doorstep for my parents, and I've still, bless them, I've still got mum and dad. Mum's 86 and dad's 85. Dad's got vascular dementia and is sort of part way through that journey. So we're here because I can visit them every day. I do my mum's shopping. We take them to all their medical appointments, and we just on hand. I'm there to be able to make up for causing my mum all those years of expense with hair dye.
That's what I was going to say. And they must be so proud, mate. The lad that legged it off to join the Royal Marines, finishes as a chief superintendent and now a full-on entrepreneur. They must be absolutely rapt. And I feel your pain with the dementia journey, mate, because I've got it with my mother-in-law, who's also 85. So it is brutal. But before we conclude this interview, is there anything you'd like to add, alter, or correct in relation to this journey?
Well, I'll be getting bail, Governor.
Well, do you know, I use that because I can, and but you've smiled, and everybody else who I do it to smiles, because when back in those halcyon days when we took those statements, we gave people that opportunity, and I'm giving you that opportunity now.
There's only to say thank you very much for the opportunity to chat. I hope that this interests somebody out there.
Oh, it will.
At least one person who listens to it. And the truth of the matter is that I have been very, very fortunate in life. And beyond the lesson about the amusing worm in the mud and always looking on the bright side, it's never been truer, has it, that a smile will take you right round the globe, but a frown gets you nowhere, does it?
You're absolutely right.
I've been blessed to have a healthy and happy life, and there you go.
Well, thank you so much. You've made me laugh and cry in equal measure, mate, if I'm perfectly honest with you. But thank you so much for your time today, and it's been a real privilege, and I mean that, to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Likewise, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, God bless, mate.